Introducing our incredible panelists for our discussion today. But first, I wanted to welcome everyone to Creating Inclusion and Equity for Disabled Professionals. I'm Jamelia Morgan. I teach disability law here at Northwestern, among other courses, and this is an important set of conversations to be having at our law school. And so I'm grateful that we're able to convene this discussion. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Meredith McBride is a creative, thoughtful, and strategic advocate who represents clients in all phases of complex civil and criminal matters, with a particular focus on clients in highly regulated industries such as healthcare, banking, and insurance. She has successfully defended class actions, civil and criminal securities matters, and False Claims Act suits, and navigated government and regulatory investigations to favorable outcomes. She has significant experience representing False Claims Act plaintiffs at both the district court and appellate level, and currently focuses on FCA practice exclusively on the realtor side. Outside of her client-facing practice, Meredith is committed to increasing disability access and inclusion within and beyond the legal profession. She lives with Ehlers-Danlos or Danlos syndrome and ADHD, and serves on several different boards and committees related to disability issues, including the Associate Board of the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. Meredith is also an adjunct professor at this law school. Prior to joining her current firm, Goldman Ishmael, Meredith practiced at a national law firm and clerked for Judge David Hamilton at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, as well as Judge Edmund Chang of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. She graduated first in her class at Northwestern Law, where she served as the inaugural empirical articles editor for the Northwestern Law Review, and before law school worked as a musician, educator, and social scientist. Next, we have Chime Asonye, a lawyer, public policy advisor, and development practitioner. He currently is a regional, or I guess it's maybe not so current, but formerly a regional Get Out the Vote director for the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz coordinated presidential campaign. Additionally, he serves as the founder of Nigerian Mental Health, the country's largest multidisciplinary community of practitioners and persons with disabilities, with over 40+ mental health focused organizations working to advance policy advocacy, research, and wellness programming. His organization was central to coordinating advocacy that helped pass Nigeria's National Mental Health Act in December 2022, the country's first human rights-focused mental health reform post-independence. His thought leadership on psychology issues is featured in the Harvard Africa Policy Review, CNBC Africa, and the World Economic Forum, among others. Earlier, he advanced the UN Global Goals, first federally serving as an associate for the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President of Nigeria on the UN Millennial Development Goals. Second, at the subnational level, as the Senior Special Assistant to the Governor of Abia State, Nigeria, on Sustainable Development Goals. Chime received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and Philosophy from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and is yet another distinguished alum of this law school, where he co-founded the Visibility Initiative and was awarded the 2021 International Alumni Award for his work. So we are grateful to you both for joining us for this important conversation, and particularly happy to welcome you both back as distinguished alums of our law school. All right, so the first question that I'd like to start with is one resounding in advice. What advice would you have for managers, professionals, those of us working within a workplace, many of us, of course, for how to better support people with disabilities in their workplace? What do non-disabled allies need to hear to be a partner to colleagues in the workplace? And maybe we could start with you, Meredith.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jamelia, and for the introduction. It's great to be here. So the first and foremost thing that I think, at least in the US context, people need to hear is that the ADA is not enough. It's a bare minimum. Obviously, it's a law we all have to comply with. It is not synonymous with equity and inclusion for people with disabilities in the workplace, and especially to help support us in reaching our full potential of everything we have to offer. And so I think it's really important for managers and for just colleagues to be proactive in not only messaging inclusion, but overtly doing things that are inclusive, looking for ways to provide more options and more points of entry for any activity in the workplace, any event in the workplace, proactively asking people what accommodations they may need or what flexibility or changes they may need to any given situation. And also modeling that, right? So if you're a manager who has a disability or somebody who maybe is just going through some sort of personal situation, right? You don't have to share all the details, but you can just say like, hey, I'm taking today off. I'm not feeling so well. You know, I'll see you all tomorrow or whatever. Modeling that kind of self-care and modeling the flexibility that we all need from time to time. And some of us need, you know, more than others and in different ways, and just normalizing that. So I think that's sort of the baseline that I would really like to see. Too often I've heard people say, well, if they need an accommodation, they'll come talk to me about it. But first of all, that's just a minimum. And second of all, people don't feel comfortable to come talk unless you've already proactively taken those steps.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I agree with everything that Meredith said. I don't want to, I think the key thing that I'd focus on what she said is things like flexible work arrangements, obviously offering remote or flexible work arrangements, which are more accessible now post-pandemic. Things like physical accessibility aids can be very important, whether it's modifying physical environments to remove obstacles and making facilities more accessible, ramps, lifts, accessible restrooms. When we created, for instance, the visibility initiative at Northwestern, not only was it diverse representation in the context of social justice or what the landscape of justice looks like, but it was also not just what's on the wall, but how people navigated the institution. So ramps, inclusive, so disability is an important part of the conversation. You have to be clear in terms of communication and policy enforcement. So people need to be respectful of accommodations, discussing it without stigma. You have to create those important safe spaces, which are important. And I think employers and managers can offer things like mental health days, which aren't usually offered. Right now, we just think about sick days. People don't usually offer mental health days, offer counseling services or employee assistance programs in terms of networks if people want to discuss things that they're dealing with when it comes to mental health challenges. Basic things like ensuring that employee insurance covers mental health care, which is not always the case and is very, very important. And then I think that there needs to be, if you think that disability awareness is important, you have to systematically do trainings on it. So in educating, fostering understanding to reduce stigma towards disability. And there's a lot of studies about, for instance, the National Organization of Disability, that companies that require managers and supervisors to take part in annual disability trainings actually had increased retention of persons with disabilities. So it's not just getting them in, but making sure that they stay in. And you can use things like advocacy awareness days to do this. A lot of organizations don't, but you should be thinking about it. You know, in America, for instance, there's a lot of focus on like Juneteenth or Black History Month or Women's History Month. The same thing exists for disability. So for instance, Disability Pride Month is in July, Mental Health Awareness Month is in May. We have advocacy days like the World Health Day on April 7th, World Mental Health Day on October 10th, and coming up, if you want an excuse to do something, in December 3rd, you have International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And the final thing is I would encourage open dialogue and creating safe zones and regular check-ins. I think as a manager, you understand kind of the demands that are on your employees. And so you know when they're more stressful, or even the nature of the assignment, whatever it is, may be more stressful or challenges. Make sure you have a check-in with them to see how they're doing, so they can understand how they can understand their conditions and just provide the space and a safe zone to discuss and talk.
Great. I think that's so important. It seems like in both of your answers, there was a huge focus on organizational culture, the structures, the policies, the practices. And Meredith, as you started us off, the ADA establishes an important floor, right? A set of legal duties on the part of employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities. But that's not enough, right, to create this culture of inclusion that you both are discussing. So within that context, how can people with disabilities and allies who now occupy what we would say are positions of relative privilege and authority, right? Positions of power within an organization. They're differently situated from individuals that come in, the newest employee to the junior staff attorney. What can they do specifically in this context? And maybe it's breaking down some of the ideas so we can particularly focus on the decision makers, those with authorities within organizations, law firms, law schools, what have you. Oh, sorry. Maybe we'll start with you. Same order.
Okay.
Sure. So this is something I've seen a lot. I think we need to go back to a foundational concept of disability, which is that, you can be born with it, as I was. You can also acquire disability at any point throughout your life. So just statistically speaking, as people age, they're more likely to have more opportunities to join our club, right? So as we have more senior people in the workplace, there's probably a higher percentage of folks who are disabled or chronically ill by that point in time. And I've seen personally a number of these folks, continue to hide that they have a disability or chronic illness, and also not even sort of grapple with that change in identity that they have experienced, which I think really reduces their capacity as leaders to create an inclusive environment for the rest of us who have disabilities and chronic illnesses and those needs in the workplace. So the first thing I would love to see is I would love for attorneys to be educated on when you're disabled or when you're not disabled, right? And obviously that's an identity issue that people can sort of work through for themselves and decide where they want to claim that term, but recognizing like, hey, if I'm now dealing with a certain health condition, that puts me in this category of people who may benefit from this flexibility and can lead in that respect. Second of all, I think sort of living your needs out loud as a person in a position of authority is really, really powerful, right? Overtly saying like, again, I need to be off today, or I have an appointment to go to, or I'm going to use, this accommodation that might be visible, or I need to take a break right now. Whatever it might be within your teams to normalize that, because change starts at the top in hierarchical workplaces, like many of legal workplaces that we are in. And then to use your seniority and your authority to put policy changes in place, whether that's just on your team or for your organization as a whole. So it could be, some of the points that Chime was making about benefits and, mental health days and cultural norms, right? You can be that person who's the voice for change when it's something that you've experienced and understand the value of. And those of us with disabilities often have insights into what is needed or could be beneficial in a way that people who have not had those experiences do not have. And so use that insight and knowledge to say, hey, we really need to have this benefit available across our organization, or we really need to train, everyone who's in a supervisory role in this organization on certain issues and how to train their teams on those issues. And making sure that there's accountability around that in whatever way your organization, holds itself accountable to various goals and benchmarks. And again, it doesn't mean you have to share all the details of your personal experience if you don't want to, but you can just use the insights you've gained as to what's important and what's needed and try to be that voice, and not view it as synonymous with having earned the right, so to speak, to have those accommodations and benefits in place, right? Which is something we see a lot in the legal workplace. And something I was told, I'm also the parent of a child with disabilities. And I was told, maybe if you were a partner when your kid became sick, you would have more flexibility to deal with the various needs around that. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry, my son didn't get sick on, the timeline that was convenient for the firm. But it is what it is. And I'm an associate, this was a few years ago dealing with this situation. And so again, this is not something you should have to earn over time with your seniority, but just something that's sort of a human right and need of anyone in the workplace. And people in senior roles can make sure that that sort of trickles down beyond just people at their level of seniority.
Chime, anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, lots to add. I just want to echo this. This is really an important point that Meredith talked about, that disability not only is growing, but it's a collective part of everybody's future. This is really important for individuals to get, whether it's by injury or violence of time. Numbers of persons with disabilities are growing exponentially because of demographic change. aging was mentioned by her, but also chronic things like health disparities. We're understanding it more. And when we think about the context of this, um, according to the World Health Organization, it's over 1 billion people. That's 15%. And if you don't, depending on whether you think women is a minority or not, a lot of people think that this is the largest global minority. So thinking, if you're in a position of power and thinking that persons with disabilities are human and deserving of support, and modeling them and emphasizing out there is very, very key, because a lot of people don't understand how big this demographic is and how all of it is a ground state of our human existence. The other thing is about the value of lived experience, which is very critical. If you are in a position of power, then you also are important part of the governing authorities that ensure that people who have lived experience of disability are the helm of leading or co-leading projects with that thematic issues or on organizational initiatives. We have to value people's lived experience, and there's immense value associated with that. And it's not theoretical experience about thinking about disability, but people's real world experience. We heard Meredith discuss the challenges and her son or her child, and what that means. That type of experience can't be replicated, and that's why those individuals need to be in positions of power. And if you're there, you can help elevate them. And this is not just me saying it. This is international best practices, looking at the leading international human rights instruments. If you look at things like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that both the United States signed in 2009, and I always point to Nigeria in 2007. It talks about incorporating those with lived experience. If you look at findings from the Lancet, which is basically Lancet Commission on Ending Stigma and Discrimination, it also emphasizes incorporating those with lived experience. And if you're in a governing authority, you can do that. At an institutional level, you can establish anonymous reporting systems that allow employees to report instances of ableism and receive reports and support without fear of retaliation. You can support things around psychological safety, which is key to create an environment where people feel secure in voicing their concerns. There's studies on this that talk about how when there's more psychological safety and there's more safe space exhibited, there's increased levels of trust, open communication, effective collaboration from a 2022 service. You can provide mentor and advice. And I say this because, you know, we in a lot of affinity organizations, we may have Black individuals or women individuals reaching out to mentors. That doesn't happen as much with persons with disabilities. So you can be reaching out for the next generation, understanding what their challenges are, and providing that personal touch. And a lot of times, a younger associate or a younger person will not reach out for mentorship, but you can identify it. And I've had a lot of mentors in my life, whether it's because of my Black identity, my Nigerian identity, or whatever, saw something to me and they reached out to me proactively, they help mentor. So you can mentor and advise. If you're in a company, you can't push for policy advocacy, and we see it all the time. Pushing for policy advocacy at the national and state level to support things. And the final thing I'll say is that if you have reached this, you a lot of times have access to purse strings with corporate social responsibility dollars. So you can fund initiatives at the local and national level supporting persons with disabilities. Right now, my organization, along with the support of the Center for Racial and Disability Justice and other organizations like Shell, we put on an immersive conference which help people embody what it would feel like to have a mental health condition and use that as an advocacy technique. Corporations help support our efforts because they think it was important, and they also sent their clients and their staff to experience it as well. So if you have those purse strings and you've attained that level, please consider supporting NGOs and nonprofits in doing this important work.
So I have a couple questions. So I want to ask both of you to talk about, you lifted the term Chime ableism. I want you both to, talk about what ableism means to you and how you came to understand the term. But I was struck by, the comments that both of you made, how important it is in our field to claim disability. And many of us that identifies people with disabilities, we claim it as an important effort in destigmatizing disability and demonstrating that a career in law in particular is possible as a person with a disability. And I was wondering what you all think about, like, the notion that, like, our field is particularly challenging on bodies and minds. We can see this in the rates of substance use within the legal profession, the rates of sort of individuals that report having mental health challenges, as termed in the American Bar Association has reported on that. There's like a strong able-body norm that we could see running throughout law. Like, how can we think about that alongside these important efforts to sort of claim disability, respond to the sort of challenges that people with disabilities might face in the workplace, structurally, organizationally, what have you? So maybe we could take maybe any reactions you might have to that. I know it's a big question, and then we can shift to ableism.
I've been practicing ladies first, but I guess I could take a stab at this. That is a big question. I'm actually, so I'm going to start on the last part first,
Mhm.
which is the claiming the mantle of ableism and discussing it. To be honest, is something I'm still reconciling myself. I was noticed in Meredith McBride's introduction. She talked about her disability. I've been diagnosed with mental health conditions. I'd never talk about it often, except for in safe spaces. I'm actually just saying I probably wouldn't have said it in this conversation unless I heard that introduction from Meredith or you specifically asked that question. I'm in a space where I don't want to say I'm young, but I'm also, working in Nigeria, it is, and globally, there's always a lot of excuses to exclude you. And so I don't really particularly like to give people ammunition and just kind of deliver and handle my personal accommodations with myself. And I guess that goes to the question of like how I came to understand ableism. Um, First of all, when I was in high school, I debated. I was a debater in high school, and we debated a topic focused on mental health. And that is the first time where I grapple with ideas or understood things around Ritalin or ADHD or chronic mental health on being more pervasive in a criminalization setting or around Native American alcoholism and things like that, and what these ideas of normalcy kind of imbued. And then again, I came to this conversation with in law school, where you're talking about there's chronic challenges when it comes to persons with disabilities. That's actually, I crashed in my first year of law school. I went to the emergency room. My doctor said that they don't think that this is just a challenge with physical disability. They think that it may have some mental health condition. And I had actually years ago had a test and never looked at the test results. And it found out based on crashing and needing that to get resources in the mental health center that I had been diagnosed with two mental health conditions that I'd been existing and living with. I never knew during the course of my life. And even in law school, I was trying to figure out ways to exist and survive in that space, which is why I created the Visibility Initiative, which exists now today, which is about the aesthetics of the law school and how people experience the space and the fact that I didn't feel at home in that space and it was hard to study and work. And I remember, this is also during the time of Black Lives Matter. It's very strange because Jamil, you mentioned my job right now as a Harris organizer. And for all the Get Out the Vote directors, they gave us a sweatshirt that said "Get Out the Vote," and I told them that I don't want to wear a sweatshirt because sweatshirts with Black bodies imply certain things when we're walking at the nights. It's not interpreted the same way as others, and so I remember the walk from the law school to the parking lot and trying to be very visible about who I was, and when you're during finals, you're like you're not shaved and everything like that, and so I looked like a hoodlum, and I was walking to the parking lot and I was scared literally, and that was a couple of blocks away. So it does manifest in certain ways. It is very challenging. And even in law school, I didn't have the language for it. I was just trying to figure out survival and resilience tactics. And that's what the Visibility Initiative was. We're trying to get representation of art and people and individuals that look like us, trying to create disability justice around the ramps and things like that. And I'm glad that initiative is continuing to exist till today. But if we think about ableism writ large, it's about valuing people based on constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, and intelligence. And a lot of people don't understand that these have profound impacts. I already discussed of how big as a demographic, but we have to think about it a little bit differently when we're thinking about this. There's a study that I like to quote from the European Review of Social Psychology, and it found that ableism is among the most common and strongest form of implicit bias, surpassing others such as gender and race. So when we think about bias, we think about, okay, racial bias or disability bias, but implicit bias is the one you're not really even conscious of. So that and ageism are some of the leading causes of prejudice. And thinking about mental health, working in mental health is how I really started thinking more about disability justice. When we think about it structurally, we have to think about how big of a challenge this is when it comes to ableism, because a lot of people don't understand. People with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to experience violence, according to the World Health Organization and UN. A lot of persons with disabilities, die up to 20 years earlier than those without disabilities. And and because I'm focused on mental health, I always think about the impacts of mental health in general. Suicide is a significant public issue. It's one of the leading causes of death worldwide. Suicide kills more people every year than HIV, AIDS, violent dates, terrorism, war. 800,000 people a year die to suicide. And I don't want to pay oppression Olympics, but if you compare that to something like the war in Gaza right now, where maybe, let's just say 100,000 people have died, 40,000, 10,000, however you look at those numbers, there's many multiples of death that occurred suicide and doesn't get the public attention. So we need to think about how big as a structural challenge this is when we think about ableist violence writ large.
Thank you, Chime. Meredith, anything to add? How do you think about ableism and how did you come to understand the term?
Yeah, let me tell a little bit of my story within the legal profession to speak to some of the additional points that in your question originally, Jamelia, on that. So I'm a second generation lawyer. Both of my parents are lawyers. My mom is also disabled. She also has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It's a dominant inheritance genetic disorder and is deaf. And she was on stealth mode for her entire legal career up until a couple of years ago. So 35, 40 plus years into her career. And what I grew up seeing was two visions of disability in the legal profession. One was my mom being extremely successful in the workplace, achieving, external markers of success, being a partner, being sort of a national thought leader in her practice area, all kinds of great stuff. No one knew she was disabled in any way. She had no accommodations. I have no idea how someone who's 80% deaf practiced law in that era of technology with no accommodations, but somehow made it work. And at home, the stress level that put on her was through the roof and caused mental health and substance issues that I grew up with and suffered terribly with as a child. So when I became a lawyer, as somebody who has at least some of the same disabilities, and as a parent, I had to think about how am I going to live my life differently? I would love to have some of the same markers of success in the workplace, but my vision of success as a parent and as a person has to be very different than what I grew up with. And that involves me living differently in my professional identity than my mother did, because I am not going to have the toll behind the scenes that I grew up with. And I need to model something different for my child who also has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, right? So as he's growing up and thinking about caring for himself, building a life for himself, building a vision of success for himself as a whole person in the world, I need to model that in a way that I never had that modeled for myself growing up. And that took me many years as an adult to kind of come to terms with a healthy, sort of holistic picture for myself. And so for me, this is why I am super front and center about the fact that I'm disabled, in part because my disability is sometimes invisible, depends on the day, whether I'm using a mobility aid that day, et cetera. But oftentimes, I can kind of go under the radar. But it's important to me to front that and to proactively create a structure of accommodations for myself and of sort of workplace arrangements so that I can feel not only supported in terms of my health needs, but also so I can be successful as a professional, right? When I look at the times I've had the most support for my health needs, it's obviously correlated to success that I've had in school and work. Because when you're struggling with your health, it's very hard for anything else to be going well. My mental health is a million times better when I'm not stressed about, trying to compensate in all of these counterproductive ways for my health needs while also keeping it a secret and wondering what would happen if someone found out. And I want to be really clear that I'm only able to do this because of other privileges I have as a person and in the legal field. But because I have those privileges, I feel like I can be upfront about my disability. And there are probably people who aren't excited to work with me because of that, but I would rather filter those people out up front than be in relationship with them only to have that relationship be built on a foundation that is not ultimately supportive for me. Because I see the toll it takes. And I don't think it's coincidence that we have such high rates of stress and substance abuse and mental health in our profession, not only because, obviously people can have mental health conditions in and of themselves, but I see and I hear from a lot of people with, for example, untreated and unsupported ADHD who have consequent mental health toll that takes on them, right? I hear from people who have physical disabilities that are not properly accommodated, and that creates a huge amount of stress and other sort of downstream effects in the legal workplace. So I think there's a significant portion of this that's very, very interrelated to the culture of silence we have around disability. And I feel like because I have a certain degree of privilege to sort of be open about this, like, let me participate in breaking that silence. And like Chime said, sort of challenging the idea that there's a normative or one best way to be a lawyer. And frankly, I'm a much better lawyer because of my personal experience and who I am as an individual. And we all are, right? I think all of us, the strengths we have as lawyers come from the full picture of who we are as people. So I would rather not downplay that, but actually use that as an asset in my practice and in my work and my sort of presence in the workplace. So when I think about ableism being this sort of definition that there's some sort of normative way to be a person and enforcing that, it seems so delusional to me, the way that our profession is built on that. None of us are the same person. It's just not the reality of humanity in any respect. And also, like, we wouldn't want to be. And when I think about the people that I work with and the various strengths that they have, I wouldn't want carbon copies of the same person on a team, because a team is better when you have different people who have different strengths that can all contribute to the outcome. And that's really what the legal profession needs to be sort of moving toward, that model. Like, we're not all, the same kind of lawyer. And the legal profession is also like notorious for having eccentric people. Like, that's sort of a perk of the profession. And to sort of value this eccentricity and individuality in one respect, and then to have these other norms that say we all have to be homogenous, like, doesn't make any sense to me either. So I see it. I also think there's overt ableism and explicit bias in addition to implicit bias. Or like, I've had people overtly tell me, like, you can't be a good lawyer if you have ADHD. It's not possible to be a trial attorney and to be a caregiver. It's not. I'm like, just go sit down. Like, I don't need to hear from you on this. But people do hold those views sometimes. And they're not shy to say it, but it's simply not true. I mean, just look around any legal workplace at the wide range of working styles that people have, whatever the cause that may be, and that's the source of their strength. So I think it's pervasive in our profession, but I also think it's like a profound self-delusion that the profession has, and I'm just tired of living under it, and I'm interested in just calling it out wherever I see it, because I'm over it. I grew up with it. I saw how toxic it is. I'm not interested in continuing that for the next generation, whether that's the next generation in the workplace, the next generation in my family.
Just so much to take from both of your comments. And so this is one note to the audience that your chance to ask questions is coming up. But of course, the conversation has sparked a number of questions in my mind. All right, so I wanted to ask you both next to really drill down on the ways, consciously or unconsciously, ableism shows up in the workplace based on lived experience and things that you've written about. So kind of building out what you said in your prior remarks. When I hear that question, I think of exactly what you said, Meredith, the culture of silence. I liked that terminology because there is this kind of culture of silence that, again, pushes this notion of this able body attorney that doesn't need any accommodations, even though if we think about it, as you said, there's a diversity. I mean, I love the neurodiversity movement, right? There's a diversity of body minds that should be accommodated and just exist in the world. And that the idea that we don't have accommodations in our field, I mean, self-accommodations happen all the time. I mean, I'm privileged to be in a profession where I can decide what time I can show up. And as long as I'm there on time to teach, I'm given the ability to self-accommodate. Blue collar workers, lower wage workers, not given that, right? So we can think about the different kinds of workplaces in that. But also, the idea that, you have the ability to accommodate the workplace, and at least if the legal standard is importantly relevant here, although not sufficient by any means, as long as it doesn't fundamentally alter the way that work is done, like that, it's okay to alter it, right? And I think that's a good thing. It's an inclusive approach. And so I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit more about, the ways ableism might show up, maybe to kind of clue us all in into what this looks like. It's not, hearing your experience, Meredith, like being told that, like how incredibly demeaning, like it is a range of those sort of explicit forms of discrimination and bias, and maybe the more subtle ways. So any thoughts on that?
So many. I could take the whole hour. I think the billable hour is one of the biggest structural instantiations of ableism in our profession. There's a million ways that the billable hour is, I mean, there's a lot of critiques of it for all humans, but I think it's especially challenging for people with disabilities, especially energy limiting conditions or any condition where your lived experience changes from day to day, which again is the human condition, but more prominent for some of us with certain disabilities. Productivity can't be measured in hour-long units when you're in a sort of nebulous knowledge profession like ours. And so it's a mismatch for a lot of things, but especially the failure of imagination in creating new models of value and pricing in the profession is, I think, one of the biggest determining factors of ableism in private practice. And there's a lot of consequences that flow from the billable hour in the workplace that I think sort of continue to reinstantiate ableism in the legal field. But I also think a lack of, I think power and hierarchy in the legal workplace continue to take the biggest toll on people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy and make it such that we don't make it to the level of partner where we would have the ability to self-accommodate more. I mean, what is a big law firm and all of the perks and all of the structural supports that it puts in place, but a giant set of accommodations, right? There's staff and resources to do a million kinds of things to make people's lives more convenient in various ways, often in ways that are very idiosyncratic for people who are in positions of power in those firms. But that is sort of based on a large pool of junior associates who are presumed to not have needs or rock the boat, right? And so I think we need to think a lot about hierarchy more so than fundamental change to the job, because people at the top of the hierarchy are already making the kinds of changes that a lot of us need. They're just able to do it because they have more latitude to do it. So for me, my big thing right now is figuring out sort of project management. I think that's actually really, really important to facilitating everyone getting what they need in the legal workplace in a non-ableist way, instead of just sort of assuming that junior people are going to be around to pick up the slack of poorly planned work. Planning in advance means that you can incorporate everyone's needs into the mix in a much more egalitarian way. It's also an important executive functioning support for those of us who need it, which I think is really, really important. And then, I think for myself and for those around me, I'm focused on figuring out how we can understand and articulate the value that we bring to a team or to the profession in a way that is not just about quantity. but it's about specific things that we're able to do and contribute. We all have those things that are really, really important, and that's what the future of our profession is. And I know for myself, the specific things that I'm really good at and can contribute are direct results of the lived experience I've had and the unique way my brain works. And so I want to lean into that and have that sort of playing to my strengths guide how I navigate ableism in the workplace. I think that the counter to that, to answer the question that was posed of how it shows up, is the idea that being a good lawyer means replicating the model of someone else being a good lawyer, which is not the case, right? And they may be a great lawyer, they may have a model that works really well for them, but recognizing that people are different in a culture that's very apprenticeship driven and precedent driven is a challenge. And so I think we need to focus on cultivating our imaginations in the legal profession in all kinds of ways, business models, workplace models, thinking about what it means to be a good lawyer and the value we can bring. And that sort of, that lack of imagination, I feel, is the biggest barrier right now. Just because someone hasn't seen it done before, they think it can't be done. When in reality, it probably has been done, and it can easily be done a different way.
Very well said. Chime, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, just to the last point that Meredith mentioned about lack of imagination, I mean, the screaming example of this is remote work in relation to COVID and the pandemic, right? Everybody, the old school logic is somebody has to come in so they're working, and then all of a sudden the pandemic happened, and it's a totally reimagined how life and work and productivity happens. And this happened to me when I was working in Nigeria. I had these bosses at Chevron. They did not want to, I had editing to do. I said, let me go and do it. And now COVID happened and they let all their staff do it. I'm frustrated, but it is what it is. I got it done. A couple of things here. The first one I want to talk about is the way that normalcy and ableism reinvents itself in companies and corporations. There's a knowledge production remit here that's important to understand. And this might be contestable to some folks, but I like to give this example because I think it's important. So earlier, I mentioned that it would be important for individuals to train on disability during advocacy days or certain sessions. And one way you could do is even talk about what disability is, because people may have a lack of understanding of that, or what the ADA in American with Disabilities Act, or in Nigeria, we have a Disability Act, et cetera, like that, or what the definitions for things that are important to me for like mental health is. And if you look to the global institutional authority for mental health, you look to the World Health Organization, and we look at their definition. Their definition for what mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And I use that definition because I totally do not like and critique it. There's these ideas of what is normal, the normal stresses of life. What does that look like? There's also a sanitized idea. There's the idea of what being mentally well-being is, working productively, which is the idea of, like producing value, very neo-capitalist idea of what mental health looks like. And you juxtapose this idea versus other ideas of what mental health could look like. If you look at the Center for Disease Control, it says mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. If you look at the American Psychological Association, it talks about a relative freedom from anxiety or disabling symptoms, a capacity to establish constructive relationships and cope with ordinary demands and stresses of life. You can see ones are more insular, more about how you were personally doing, more about relationships, and do not subscribe to this idea of normalcy or productivity or contributing to whatever the community values and things like that. And it's important I bring this up because there's a knowledge power regime that continues to supplement particular ideas of what's normal by looking at these definitions, and they're getting taught at firms or companies or businesses. And it continues to re-entrench this idea that to be mentally well, I have to be a good product, or I have to be the best billable hour, instead of just relaxing on a beach somewhere because I think that's important, or being a Tibetan monk and I'm in Zen with faith and tradition and religion, and I think that's important to achieve nirvana, a god. None of those contribute to the community, but those are all based on how you deal and engage with the life. So that's the first thing I would like to say is that I think we need to contest this globalized idea of what is normal and what is projected. And this is not, I'm not just making it up. That's the World Health Organization's definition. I think that rhetoric is important. The way we discuss and talk about things creates our reality. And there's a huge microaggressions and biases that are caused by using ableist language. And that could come in various forms, calling someone dumb or stupid because they have a speech impediment, or lazy because they're dealing with depression or anxiety, or someone who's neat or has a neat workplace calling them OCD and things like that. We should remember that we're not talking about necessarily disabled professionals. We're talking about persons with disabilities, and we should focus on that they're humans and they have a feature of their existence, whatever that feature of their existence is, whether it's their disability or anything like that. I think the other ways it shows up in workplaces has to do with inaccessible design and physical environment. For me, I most often see that in the context of ramps, but also websites. Websites is the gateway for information, and there's a lot of challenges. Not that I know we did a good job with asking if you registered, if people need accessibility needs and things like that. But there's a lot of functions I go to where those questions about accessibility are not asked. There's no person who's giving sign language or giving text to speech. Those are very important so people can access and have inclusion to various resources they need. I think that there's another challenge in terms of micromanagement when it comes with persons with disabilities. There's an assumption that persons with disabilities require constant supervision or are less competent. And that is a benevolent ableism that is treating these individuals as inherently weak or in need of rescue, and often infantilizes them, and how you treat and engage them which causes sour and corrosive relationships. And at different levels, this also can manifest. At an institutional level, it could be not promoting individuals due to the assumption of their capabilities, or setting performance standards that don't count for the flexible hours that we've been discussing, or to create barriers. It could be just comments like interpersonal comments like person doesn't look disabled, and thinking that's a compliment, and instead of thinking about people being differently abled or neurodivergent, etc. And then I think there's an internalized ableism that I discussed earlier, where employees don't want to ask for accommodations because they believe that it's a favor rather than a right. And if you look toward Nigeria's Disability Act, which Nigerian Mental Health is actually likely going to be doing a lot of advocacy from next year on, and we look at American Disabilities Act, these are human rights. These are things that are globally enshrined. These are things that the United States and Nigeria have enshrined onto, and these are things that are codified in law. So these are not like you're doing me a favor. These are things that are your legal provisions that you're entitled to.
Yes, absolutely. I think importantly, like maybe we could surface like the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is an important human rights instrument, which unfortunately the US has not signed on to. But the overall frameworks, I think, should guide our account of disability in the global context. So I have a couple questions coming through from our audience, which I think are pretty terrific. And so if I may, I'll pose the first one. For those of us who aren't in leadership positions yet, what tips do you have for being an effective ally for disabled colleagues in the workplace? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is being a good communicator about what everyone's needs are. And again, it doesn't mean you need to have people share information that they don't necessarily want to share, but you can simply ask things like, hey, in planning for this upcoming, for example, I do a fair amount of child work, right? Like what food do folks on the child team want to have on hand, right? People are going to say, I prefer this, I prefer that. You can make sure that people's needs are met. What equipment do we need to have available for people? I need this, I need that, right? Just making sure that you're opening those conversations clearly so that people can voice their needs and have those met. It doesn't have to be through a super formalistic accommodations framework, or, hey, we're thinking about planning one of these three, group social events, like which one seems good to you, letting people have some choice and some voice in the process. so that they can sort of self-accommodate and self-advocate even in a subtle way. Building in multiple options to everything that you offer to the greatest extent possible. Whether that's seating availability, whether that's format to get communications in, right? Always turning on captioning at a web event, things like that. You can look up neuro-inclusive communication styles. Those work for many, many people, even if they're not neurodivergent. There are other disabilities that also benefit from neuro-inclusive communication styles. For example, offering written communication as well as spoken communication at meetings, circulating an agenda in advance so people can prepare themselves and raise any additional points they may have, right? So there are things you can proactively do to educate yourself and look up sort of what people need. And don't wait for your colleague to sort of reveal themselves as a person with a disability, right? Like 14% of lawyers or whatever have ADHD, 30–40% have a mental health condition. 25% of adults overall have a disability of some kind. I guarantee you, you are working with multiple disabled people in your workplace on a day-to-day basis, whether you know it or not. So just assume that that's the case, and take the opportunity to read about different needs people may have and different disabilities, and just start making those a habit for people around you. And you will start to be not only providing that inclusion and accessibility for people, but also, as Chime was saying earlier, creating that psychological safety so that if there are more specific or detailed things people need to talk about, they're going to feel comfortable doing it.
I think that when we think about disability, we need to understand that there's global frameworks, as has been mentioned, and we need to dethrone the American hubris that we have all the answers here. 80% of the 1 billion people who have disabilities are living in low and middle income countries or the developing world, according to the World Health Organization and the UN. So we need to look at best practices globally for what we can incorporate, whether it's from, like I said, the rights of persons with disabilities, the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or different practices. So I think that that's a key thing that we don't often do. We often look at just American answers for the challenges that are going on, when a lot of people, because this issue is so big, are grappling with this, and there's best practices globally to think about. I think folks need to be doing accessibility audits. I mean, just in general for events, especially, I think sometimes it's good to do it in an ad hoc way, but it's also good to just have a checklist when you're going through an event and thinking through some of the things that might be required for a person with disability in that planning process, and advertising as such, because you may do it, but people don't know you're doing it, and they don't show up for the event because there's that access to barrier. So you need to do an accessibility audit and then also advertise that you're doing it. I will tell you that there's a professor that I know, I think she's at Emory. She will not go to your event or attend or talk at it if you do not have accessibility audit that's advertised. So this is a real thing for real individuals as you think through things. I think that folks need to measure. If you don't measure, it doesn't count. And you can get your corporation to start thinking about this being as a signal for having a good workplace. So there's something called the Disability Equality Index, which is from the American Association of People with Disabilities and the U.S. Business Leadership Network that people can subscribe to. It scores companies on persons with disabilities. There's something that I've been watching a lot closely, focused on mental health, for instance, called the Mental Health Workplace Index. It's from One Mind at Work, Columbia University's Mental Health and Work Design Lab at Ethisphere. It's a self-assessment that individuals can do that measures things like investments in mental health, evidence, and things like that. So I think that if we can make the case to our companies that let's do an audit, let's do an index, let's try to strive for being one of the greatest workplaces in terms of mental health, get as part of these indexes, and that will help encourage. And then a final thing I'm going to say is this. I think that we need to stop whitewashing some of these challenges. And I say this as somebody who, like, for instance, went to Northwestern, and when I was dealing with the mental health challenges at the school or provided resources like meditation or mindfulness, it was always discussed kind of abstractly, not divorced from the social context we were dealing in. Maybe it was Black Lives Matter, or maybe it was, however you feel about the election, or however, or maybe if it feels about reproductive health. The social context that excludes and causes violence on marginalized bodies is part of the reasons why there needs to be psychological safety and security. So we can't just say, here's a tool, embrace it. Sometimes we have to connect that tool with actually what's going on, and not divorce those issues, because they're part and parcel of why we need that psychological resistance, why we're dealing with that societal trauma in the first place. And yeah, I think that I want to, like, if there's something I want you to circle and star, it's this particular issue that I just mentioned, because it's the thing I see the most across different companies, academic settings, when it comes to mental health and psychological well-being.
Thank you. All right. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to ask a general question from one of our participants about internalized ableism. So I'm going to read the question, and then you all can sort of think through, how can we respond to internalized ableism? So the questioner asks, as someone who also has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, how do you convey that in spite of having it and the other associated things that come with it, this can be a strength as a student and a lawyer? I've recently confronted my internalized ableism, and I'm looking forward to identifying as disabled. But while at the very beginning, I'm concerned about being seen as a liability. Thoughts and reactions to dealing with internalized ableism?
Hello, fellow Zebra. Feel free to reach out if you want to talk more specifically about EDS and lawyering. Maybe I already know you. I feel like I know a lot of our alumni and students who have EDS. There are a lot of us, actually, for one. Anyway, I think like having a good sense of your own value as a person and also your specific strengths as a professional is the best you can do. You can't control how other people are going to view you, right? Like the only thing you have some degree of control over is yourself and your own work, on yourself and on the internalized ableism. There will be people who will view it negatively. You can decide how much of the work of educating them you want to take on. It is really exhausting. And so, sometimes we're up for it and sometimes we're not, and that's fine. But that doesn't change the value that you have just for being a person. And I'm sure there's many unique things that are great about you and strengths that you bring to the table. As someone with EDS specifically, there are certain strengths that we have that no one else has who hasn't gone through something similar, right? Like people with chronic pain who are able to do some of the things that we've done despite being in excruciating pain. Let me give you a story. When I gave birth to my oldest son, I labored for over 24 hours with no pain medication, and it didn't feel like a big deal to me. And I said something to my doctor like, oh, that wasn't so bad. She's like, what are you talking about? Like you were having like a very difficult labor. And I was like, it wasn't as bad as what I feel on a daily basis with EDS. It really wasn't. Like, I'm not exaggerating this, right? Like this is the level of pain that we live with every day, many of us. And I'm still out here kicking ass, right? Like I am super, super tough because this is what I've lived with my entire life. Like literally I've been symptomatic since I was an infant with Ehlers-Danlos, right? If we can do that, like we can deal with a lot of stuff that would break most people, right? Like we have some really unique strengths because of our experience that, we can bring. We understand what it's like to live with profound uncertainty and stress. And I think that can make us super, super level-headed in legal situations that require that, right? Like we have certain capabilities that have been formed through our experience that are huge assets that you just cannot develop unless you've had a personal experience that's taught you some of these skills. And so to the extent you're comfortable leaning into that, and again, you can give whatever level of detail you can give, but like your toughness, your empathy, your ability to flex and navigate and keep making things work and being creative about it is like that's disability gain. That's what it is. And, you know, that's a really important concept to sort of advocate for ourselves and to hold really closely as things that we have that are strengths.
Thanks, Meredith.
So, um, it took me a while to come to a realization of why I was working in the mental health field. Um, and then it came to me like last year, which is that I think people who look like me at times have difficulty expressing our pain. Um, and I couldn't really quite like it's hard. It's if I get cut, it's easy to talk about that. If I'm shot by the police, it's easy to talk about. If I feel unsafe psychologically, or if I am dealing with trauma, it's hard to express that um, and express the constant state of insecurity and that fragility. And and so engaging in this field, in this work, has helped me navigate um, in such a way where I could finally communicate some of these challenges in a way that I couldn't not do before. I could talk around the issue, but I couldn't really talk with the issue and connect with people on that. So I think that as a way of expressing our humanity, it's important. And if that gives you solace, it's something to think about, because you start navigating these challenges, you start navigating what you're dealing with, and you start finding evidence and best practice that can help you articulate that. And I think that, especially for Black and brown bodies, that's very important. The second thing is that um, I am in this field as, I guess, a leader, um, and as a wellness practice. And this might seem strange, but when we think about wellness practices that can help with psychological flourishing, people might suggest, like I said, meditation or mindfulness, but there's also music and art therapy and going on walks and things like that. There's yoga. For me, being affirmative and doing something about this and trying to improve the situation helps me gain understanding, helps me feel like I am affirmatively trying to correct the challenges I see. And it helps me with my fragile psychological state. It helps me by being affirmative in it as a wellness practice. So it's kind of reciprocal in that way. This actually helps me support myself. And so that's the other bridge I found in doing this type of work. People shouldn't think about whatever your thing is. People use prayer therapy, right? People, along with using traditional biomedical tools like drugs and things like that, whatever your thing is, you should embrace it. And I think that we shouldn't divorce the fact that activism or activism or being a leader in this field can also help you not only grapple with these issues, but also solidify who you are and what you can do to change the situation.
So this has been such a generative discussion. I just, want to thank you both for just coming with such candor and honesty and sincerity and courage. You've given us a lot of detail, and importantly, this is, I think, going to inform a lot of what we do going forward as students, as professors, as lawyers, as staff attorneys. It's just been an incredible hour for me. And so I know we've gone a little bit over and we have more questions, but I just want all of us in our virtual space to extend thanks to you both for the work that you're doing, the advocacy, but also for representing in our community so well, and doing so, again, as I said, with courage. So thank you all for your time. You make Northwestern Law School, Pritzker Law School proud, and you make me just happy to be doing this work alongside you. So thank you both, Meredith and Chime. And with that, our event will conclude. We invite you all to stay in touch. Look these folks up. They're amazing. If you're interested in learning more, check us out at the Center for Racial and Disability Justice. You all know where to find me. But it's really been great to share the hour with you all. Thank you.
Please reach out to me. My email is on my law firm website. I would love to hear from people and talk about disability related issues. We have a really thriving community here in our alumni and student community. I think it's really important for us to be in touch with each other.
Absolutely.
Well, just look me up. My name's there. I'm on everything. Just say you saw me here and I'll respond.
All right.